So, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. Really pleased to see a good group joining us today for this month's installment of the AGU AGI Heads and Chairs webinars. So, just a few introductions. Pranoti Asher, who is the Assistant Director for Grants and Education Programs at AGU and is an AGI Scholar in Residence, is also online with us. And I also want to acknowledge that Leila Gonzalez, also with AGI, is here helping in the production today. And in fact, Leila will step us through a few key points about using this Teams platform for today's meeting.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I just want to get everyone oriented to our Teams control panel. We have a few icons here that will be very handy for everyone. So probably the most important one is the microphone button here, so everyone can see that. We just ask everyone, if you're not talking or actively joining the discussion, please keep your mic muted, just so that we can preserve audio clarity. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Pranoti.
All right. Thank you so much, Leila, and thanks, Chris, for the introduction. Today's webinar is a great collaboration between AGU, AGI, and the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. Our webinar today by Karen and Anne, we're going to discuss tools and strategies for finding programmatic strengths and weaknesses. Karen is a faculty member at the Department of Geoscience at Boise State University and the current president of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. And Anne is a professor also in the Geosciences, but also holds a dual position in science education at Central Washington University. Anne is the current executive director of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. So please take it away.
Thanks, Pranoti. Hopefully you can now all see my slides. Thank you everyone for joining today. We're really excited to be leading this webinar. And as Pranoti mentioned, this is a collaboration with NAGT. This webinar really highlights a lot of the work that NAGT has been supporting and sponsoring and doing itself over many years with other organizations. And now we have quite a few really robust resources that both Karen and I have used in our own programs and have helped others use along the way. So hopefully this will help you think about your own programs as well. The slides are available on the website. Leila mentioned that. There are lots of live links in here, so you can either download them and follow along now, or you can get them after the workshop and be able to follow through with some of the resources. So I'm going to turn it over next to Karen.
Great, thanks, Anne, and welcome everyone. So before we start talking about specific tools and strategies for finding your programmatic strengths and weaknesses, we wanted to introduce this framework for thinking about how the components of your program fit together. So this framework is adapted from DFINC, who uses it to talk about course design, but the same concepts apply no matter what scale you're thinking about. So it could be a lesson, a course, or an entire degree program. Hopefully you've already written program learning outcomes for your program, and those are shown at the top of this triangle. And these outcomes define what you want students to be able to do as a result of completing your program. So students take courses, they do research, they do internships as part of your program, and hopefully that combination of things allows them to meet those program learning outcomes. And then you have ways to assess the degree to which students meet those program outcomes. That's down in the bottom right-hand corner. And that's the focus of the webinar today. So all of these things feed into each other, and you might make adjustments to your curriculum or to your program learning outcomes or to how you're assessing program learning outcomes. And all of those things are done to maximize student learning. The situational factors that are shown at the bottom, those could be things like university requirements for the number of credits that are allowed in your program, or the areas of expertise of your faculty, or other things that guide or dictate how your program operates. Next slide, Anne. So there are a lot of important reasons why we look for programmatic strengths and weaknesses, or why we assess our programs. Your immediate motivation might be that your institution is asking you to do it. But if you're thoughtful about the process, then you'll end up doing these other things, right? Like you will identify places for improvement that are going to lead to better student outcomes, or you'll highlight areas for success. And those you might want to highlight for your institution, but they also let you know the places in your program where you are succeeding and where you don't need to make adjustments. Having data about strengths and weaknesses is going to help you make better decisions about how to modify your program, and will help you monitor how changes you make are impacting student learning. Okay, and you can go to the next one.
So we were hoping, this is an interactive webinar, and we were hoping that we can get some interaction in the chat in particular. So if you want to start off with just, what do you feel your department or program is assessing well? So we're going to be quiet for a minute and let you start to type in there. And this is a collegial group, so feel free to share your thoughts about what you feel you're assessing well. If you want to also think about what you'd like to improve, you can do those two questions at the same time. Okay, so student learning at the course level, learning and oral presentation skills, something you assess through multiple courses. That's a great idea. Not sure. I think that's probably true of a lot of people, that you're not sure. Other thoughts about things that you're assessing well or that you'd like to improve? Success of our graduates is well assessed in our department. That's interesting. That's probably something kind of going beyond the program itself into their careers, or success in applying to graduate school. I'll put the last question up too, to see if there are any thoughts on what tools you currently use for assessment. So feel free to put answers to any of those questions up in the chat now. Okay, so others who are assessing learning in specific courses and assignments, not assessing student learning outside of courses or non-student outcomes like faculty outcomes. That's a great lead into some of the things we're going to talk about. I'd like to improve assessment of students that struggle in our classes and majors. That's a great idea. You want to reach all, make sure you're getting a good sense of all students. How to assess field skills when programs are hindered by COVID, indeed. Why students are struggling, why they're leaving. Current assessment tools based on grades, student evaluations. This is great. Okay, so we've got a pretty wide range of things that people are doing. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'll let Karen.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Okay, so your program outcomes define what students should be able to do as a result of your program. And these also define what you should be. Right now, they may not be what you're assessing. You may be assessing other things that you don't have articulated as outcomes. But writing a learning outcome that defines what you want students to be able to do as a result of your program is kind of the first step in assessing what's going well in your program and what still needs help. So maybe take a minute and type in the chat, what are your learning outcomes about? So you may not have the full language of the learning outcome in front of you, or you may not remember it. It may be long, but just give us a sense of what are some of the things that are learning outcomes in your program. So we've already had mentioned field skills, oral presentation skills. What are some other things that you are assessing in your program? Great. So interpreting geologic data, geospatial skills, quantitative skills, writing, okay, connecting field and lab skills, soft skills, networking. Okay, so a whole variety of things that we are identifying as important to our geoscience programs. And if you don't have outcomes written, or if you feel like the outcomes that you have don't encompass all of the meaningful learning that you think should happen as part of your program, then now is a good time to think about revising those. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about learning outcomes. Hopefully you have some already, but as a refresher, let's review kind of what makes a strong learning outcome so that we're all starting from a good place in thinking about how to identify strengths and weaknesses. And so you might think about the different types of knowledge that are important for students to have in your program. And that could be factual, conceptual, procedural, or metacognitive knowledge. We often get focused on the factual or conceptual knowledge, specific ideas or concepts. But procedural knowledge and metacognitive knowledge might also be really important in your program. And you may want to think about writing outcomes that are related to those ideas. Okay, so it's best to write your learning outcomes in the form of graduates from this program should be able to, and then the statements that you write to complete that sentence, they should be specific rather than vague, or rather than encompassing many things. They should be measurable or observable, since if they're not, then it makes them really difficult to assess. Those outcomes should describe meaningful learning. So if you're making the effort to write something as a learning outcome, it should be something that's really important to your program. Those outcomes should be attainable. So they should be things that students will actually be able to achieve given the time and the experiences that they will have in your program. And those outcomes should be written in clear, understandable language so that students can understand them when they look at your degree program and what they can expect to achieve as part of it. And so those statements, the students should be able to, those statements should start with an active verb. And so this slide shows some examples of active verbs in two categories. So lower order thinking skills on the left, things like identifying or defining, classifying, and then higher order thinking skills on the right, things like synthesizing, evaluating, and analyzing. It's common to see learning outcomes written using the verb understand. By the end of the degree program, students will understand blah, blah, blah. But I would encourage you to avoid using that verb because it makes outcomes difficult to assess. And so if you think about, if you have an outcome that's written that way, you might ask yourself, well, what would I actually ask students to do to figure out if they understand that thing? And then rewrite your outcome using that verb. So if you would ask students to explain or predict or draw or describe in order to demonstrate their understanding, then you could rewrite that learning outcome using that active verb instead. Okay, so these are some example program outcomes for a BS Geoscience program. And these were taken or modified from the Building Strong Geoscience Department's collection of resources that's linked on the slide. And they describe a variety of things. So communication, teamwork, geologic processes, field skills, quantitative skills, data interpretation. So a range that's similar to what you identified in the chat. And then on this slide, the verbs in each of those statements are highlighted. And so you can see that we've used a variety of active verbs at both low and high levels.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Can I define what I mean by geoscience program? I saw that in the chat. So for the purposes of this talk, we're going to use geoscience program in the broadest sense. It can be whatever you would like it to be, whatever your program is. These outcomes were pulled from a variety of programs that could have a variety of different names associated with them: geoscience, geology, earth science, environmental science. So they're just used as examples. So petroleum engineering would be geoscience. Yes. These might not be the outcomes that you would write for your petroleum engineering program, but we're just using them as examples to show kind of the form in which you would write learning outcomes. So, okay. We can go to the next one, Anne.
Okay. Do you want to just mention that teamwork one? Or?
Yeah, I think that's on the next slide.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, sure. So one of the learning outcomes that we chose to share was this: articulate the benefits and responsibilities of working as a member of a team. And when Anne and I were choosing the examples to share, we were debating the use of different verbs for some of these outcomes and kind of playing with different ways that we could write them. And so if we go to the next slide, we thought it would be helpful to look at how changing the verb kind of changes the outcome and how you would assess it. So on this slide, we've taken that one outcome, teamwork, and written it 5 different ways. And so, you know, there's 5 different, well, or 6 different verbs here that are defining the outcome that's related to teamwork. And so the important thing to take away here is that changing the verb changes how you might assess the outcome. So for example, in number 3, students should be able to describe characteristics of a well-functioning team. You could assess that by, for example, asking students to write an essay or respond to an essay type question that asks them to describe characteristics of a well-functioning team. Whereas in number 4, behave as part of a team, leading the team as needed, you would need to assess whether or not students could do that. You might want to observe them as they are functioning in a team to see if what their behavior is like as part of that team. In number 5, assemble a team with the appropriate expertise to solve a problem. You might assess that by presenting students with a problem and then asking them to assemble an imaginary team that could address the problem. And that, that's something that could be an exam question, for example. So you might have different ideas or topics in mind for your outcomes, but thinking about the verbs that you use and exactly how you express those outcomes is important and will impact how you're able to identify strengths and weaknesses. So if these ideas are new to you, or if this discussion has made you think that your current program outcomes might need revision, I would encourage you to think about applying for an NAGT traveling workshop program. Through that program, expert facilitators would work with you and your department to define your program learning outcomes and then develop plans to help students meet them and plans for assessing them. And there are several deadlines for that program, but there's one next week on October 15th. If that's something that you're interested in, you can visit the website for more information.
Yeah, there was, fortuitously, there was just an announcement today in the AGU community from Carolyn Smith about this upcoming deadline too. So you probably have an email in your inbox about it as well.
Great. Okay, if you're looking for some more inspiration for what types of things you might include in your program learning outcomes, you might look for kind of compilations of desired workforce skills. So for example, this is a list from AAC&U that describes skills that all students graduating with bachelor's degrees should have. And on the next slide is a list from the Future of Undergraduate Geoscience Education Initiative led by Sharon Moser, and this describes skills that geoscience employers are looking for in bachelor's level students. So these are just lists that we're sharing that might provide some inspiration for the types of things that you might include in your program learning outcomes.
So there's a question in the chat. Let me see. Given the new federal regulations regarding disclosure of whether or not a student's education meets licensure requirement, that's a great question. I'm going to pause on that because we will talk about licensure exams in a little bit. So hang on to that thought, Lori. A comment earlier in the chat alluded to not having any program outcomes that were not related to student learning. So this is a little bit of a diversion from what Karen was just talking about, because there's another way to think about program assessment, or there are other ways, and one is to consider program outcomes related to teaching or what's happening for faculty and instructors. So you can set goals for the nature of instruction or the nature of classes within your program, in addition to what you want students to get out of it. So this could be something like the use of active learning strategies. In my own university, the physics department is one that set goals for their courses related to using the scale-up classrooms and training all of their faculty and using that in all of their introductory level courses, which they do now, and they assess their own program against those goals. You can assess those outcomes using structured classroom observations or peer evaluations, which is a good way to go about it. Some of you might be familiar with the COPIS, the Classroom Observation Protocol for Undergraduate STEM. That's one that is quite easy to learn and pretty straightforward. If you aren't familiar with it, it's a structured observation in which an observer notes every 2 minutes what students are doing and what the instructor is doing. So this set of pie charts on the right is 2 examples from 2 different classes. So the top 2 pie charts are examples of what the students and instructor are doing in one course. The bottom 2 pie charts are what students and instructors are doing in another course. And you can see in the top set that by noting every 2 minutes what's going on, the students are mostly listening, and there's a little bit of student time asking questions, and the instructor is mostly lecturing, and there's a little bit of F-up follow-up and answering questions. And then the bottom pie charts, there's just a lot more colors, and whether or not you look at what those colors are, you can get the sense that there's more active learning going on in the classroom, even in a large lecture base. This is really easy to learn and use. There's some training videos online, and I've used it with a number of our faculty, and I've taught them, both them and students, how to use it very quickly. So it's a quite a useful way to get a first pass at what people are doing in the classroom. Then you can present these results to the instructor and talk about how they might improve or might reach whatever your programmatic goals are with regard to teaching. Another thing to think about is how you can decide what those programmatic goals are, and you can set benchmarks for your teaching and your programs based on data across all disciplines. This is from a paper published in Science with Marilyn Staines as the lead author from a couple of years ago, where they made observations in thousands of classrooms across many universities and compiled information. I won't go into this in detail, but, oh, and I left the key off this, I'm sorry. But the darker blue is more active learning strategies. Or you can compare this or use as benchmarks some teaching data from the Geosciences. So these are some results from the National Geoscience Faculty Survey. Many of you have probably filled it out in the past. It's been administered 4 times, most recently in 2016. And it reaches about 25% of geoscience faculty in the United States. We worked with AGI to get those surveys out to a large proportion of the faculty. So you can see these trends over time. These are also about active learning strategies in the classroom and about the amount of time spent on active learning. So the darkest color is greater than 50%. And on the left is introductory courses and the right is major courses. So you can, the results of this survey are available online. You can look at all of the data there and again, see how your faculty compare or set goals and benchmarks based on that existing data. So I've been focused on active learning, but there's lots of other things you can think about. And this also came up in the chat a few times about the bottom one there, practices that support inclusive learning. So the diversity of your student population, and if the teaching practices that you are employing support that diverse population. Above that, starting at the top, there's a recent paper about quantitative and data analysis skills. So that paper uses data from the faculty survey and goes into more detail about the distribution of the use of those skills in teaching. And then the second one there covers a lot of the workforce skills that Karen mentioned with respect to the future of undergraduate geoscience education employers surveys. So these are all, these data are all part of the survey, but the papers that go into a lot more detail are available through the Journal of Geoscience Education. They're all available online, and those have links if you want to check them out. So back to assessing student outcomes. So that was a slight diversion to teaching outcomes. It's something we can talk more about at the end if you have questions. But now we're going to shift back to tools for assessing student outcomes. And I included this graph just as an example because this is what we'd all love to see, right? That our pre-assessment, the students start lower and by the end of their program, they're higher, and we can assign that to what we've done in the classroom and in our programs beyond the classroom to help them improve. This is one example we'll talk a little bit more about, but there are 5 types of tools that we're going to address. So the first one there is the licensure exams, some disciplinary and skill-specific assessments, student portfolios, reflections and interviews, and alumni and employer feedback. And for each of these, we're going to structure them about the same. We'll give a little bit of information about them, what they might be useful for, and then we're going to ask a couple questions in the chat. If you've used these, what you found useful about them, or what you would like to, if you would like to use them. So be ready to just those thoughts into the chat as we go through each one. So I'm going to start out. I know there were already some questions about licensure exams. So the one that is used in the geosciences most widely is the ASBOG, the National Association of State Boards of Geologists, of State Boards of Geology, sorry. And they have a Fundamentals of Geology exam that is offered twice a year in March and October. So even though this is a national organization, national exam, students apply to take the exam through their state licensing board. And you can see this pie chart shows the distribution of the questions into these different domains. So field and general geology, et cetera. Each one of those slices of the pie shows the proportion of the tasks or the questions on that exam that are in that content area. And they, ASBOG has a program called a tool called the Curriculum Performance Assessment Tool. And that compares, you can use that to compare your students' scores, if you have more than 10 students per year, to the national averages. So this allows you to, this is an example from my university, don't tell anyone, about how our students have scored compared to the national averages. So I know that the print down at the bottom is really tiny, but the colors there, the color of the bars represents different time periods over which students took the exam. There has to be at least, I think, 8 or 10 students in each of those time periods in order for statistics to be meaningful. And then this shows the deviation from the average of those scores, so by the content domains. So you can see, for example, we're doing a little bit better in geomorphology and structure than the national average, and maybe not as good overall in hydrogeology and economics, economic geology. So this, again, this is a way not to look at individual students. That's not the goal here, but to say, is the program preparing these students? How well does the curriculum align with what they are assessing in the ASBOG exam? So this is a really neat tool, but there are a few caveats, and it will only work for you if a lot of students take this exam most years, so that you have the big enough numbers to make a meaningful comparison. The exam is not free. There is a pretty significant cost associated with it. So it's not necessarily something you can just ask students to take for assessment purposes. They would only take it if they were going on to continue with the licensure exams. And the other thing is that the tasks really focus on professional geology. Of course, that's the goal of the exam. So that may or may not be well aligned with the goals of your program, or it might align with some of the goals of your program, but not all. So this is a useful tool for a specific task, and you can keep those things in mind if it's something you'd want to use. So here are those questions. Have you used it? If so, what have you found useful? If not, is it something you think you might use? And I see there are already some questions. So someone is asking me, do I require students to take the exam, or are these students that self-select? They self-select at my university. We don't require it, partly for the cost that I just mentioned, partly because it's not what all students intend to go on to do. So it is self-selected. State board licensure requirements often include specific education requirements. Some states have specific coursework requirements. Are geoscience programs evaluating whether these requirements, separate from and in addition to licensing exams, are being met by these students when evaluating outcomes? That's an excellent question that I will open to others as you are answering this in the chat. So if anyone has used ASBOG, use their CPAC, the Curriculum Performance Assessment tool, please let us know. Does your institution, or do you know of any other institutions providing test prep courses for the ASBOG? We do not. ASBOG has test prep materials on their website that are, there might be someone here who could answer this better than me, but I will say that I think that includes tasks from previous exams or example tasks that are very similar to the exam questions. We have done some informal test preparation sessions, but no credit-bearing courses. If anyone from ASBOG wants to jump on, please feel free.
So this is Pranoti Asher. I think Deanna, I think you're on the call, on the webinar, and I think I saw Doug Rambo as well. So, and Lori, perhaps you can answer this question as well.
This is Lori Rocca, if everybody can hear me. I'm the ASBOG Examination Committee Chair. I'm also the Senior Registrar of Geology and Geophysics for the Licensing Board in California. The state licensing boards and ASBOG generally do not recommend any specific test prep course. I do know of several professional societies in California that get together and provide study sessions, and I am aware of some schools in California that specifically recommend their students take the Fundamentals of Geology exam as soon as possible after graduation and try and gear their preparation for it. But a specific prep course, I'm not aware of.
Yeah, and Martin's comment there, being a small interdisciplinary department, that does make it challenging. Both small and interdisciplinary are two things that would be challenging to use this effectively. Okay, well, if other questions come up about this during the rest of the webinar, please keep track of them and add them into the chat, and we can address them later. The next thing I'm going to talk about is disciplinary and skill-specific assessments. And you'll note that I'm linking to lots more papers in JGE, just somewhere for you to check these out. And the first two that I'm going to talk about are both disciplinary and skill-specific, and they're a particular kind of assessment called a concept inventory. So the one on top there is about mineralogy, and then the lower one is about meteorology. So these are exams or tools that you can use to assess learning gains in those particular areas. So when it says that they're validated, That's a good thing. That means that they have been tested to assure that the questions are asking what they think they're asking. So they've done multiple iterations to assure that there are minimal misunderstandings that could happen of the questions. So this is something that they've published that you can use if that's a particular learning outcome for you, for your program, or for a particular course. On the skill-specific side, that's not disciplinary. There are the value rubrics. These are something that might be familiar to all of you. They're part of AAC News, LEAP, lots of acronyms there. I won't belabor the point, but these are not actually assessments, but they are rubrics for you that you can use on many different kinds of assessments. And they're useful. I found them useful because they define how a student might progress through skills over their undergraduate career. So they define both capstone and milestones along the way, and then where a student might even be starting. So this, and they're for really broad college level skills in general. So this is the first list that Karen showed, like critical thinking, quantitative literacy, written communication. There are 16 of these in total. Even if you end up not using the rubric, they can provide some really useful ways to think about what you might expect students to be able to do at those different levels. So I definitely recommend looking at those, and there's something that you can then add a disciplinary component to. Another way to approach this is through in-house developed things you're doing within your own university that are repeated skill or conceptual assessments. So this is an example on the right there, the geologic time embedded assessments from Karen's department, where they've got a particular assessment focused on geologic time that they use in multiple courses throughout a student's career. So they're looking for improvement in this one discipline and skill specific area. So this is something you might use as a repeated measure, in which case you'd want it to be easy to implement, and so that multiple instructors are willing to do it, and also easy to assess. So goes along with this, maybe Karen, you can say if there's a who gets to do this work, and if there's a rubric that goes along with it.
Right now, I get to do this work, and there is a rubric that goes along with it. And so just to clarify, so there are 4 questions that are part of this assessment, labeled time 1 through 4 on the x-axis, and they are of generally increasing difficulty. So you can see that in general, students do better on the easier question, and that the seniors are doing better than the sophomores, and the sophomores are doing better than the intro students. So.
That's great. This is a really useful way to approach it, and it's something that you want to, it can be separate from the grade that goes with the course that's
correct.
So the things like the concept inventories are really best used as a pre and post assessment in a single course, although you could potentially compile some of these as part of your whole programmatic assessment, or they could be used in a capstone course. The value rubrics, the in-house, these might be best used as a milestone and capstone for the whole program, so that Karen's example there is across multiple courses, and a capstone assessment might be something that you develop in-house, whether it's a final assessment in a senior seminar. Many schools have used some component of their field camp as a capstone assessment, or a senior thesis are all examples of sort of in-house capstone assessments that you might have in-house rubrics for. Okay, here are the questions. if you want to throw in a few thoughts about if you've used these or others. If so, what has been particularly useful to you? If not, if it's something you might use. This is something I will say here we are starting to use. We've just developed a new sequence of courses that's focused on skill development, and we're going to have a common assessment across all of those courses. They're all at the sophomore level. As soon as that assessment's ready, I'm happy to share it with all of you, but it's not ready yet because I think we have this sense that we are trying to build skills in things like graph reading and data literacy, but we don't know if we're doing that well or doing it yet at all. So we're hoping to demonstrate that by taking multiple of these sophomore level courses. We'll be able to see that students' skills improve as they take more courses. So discipline-specific assessment administered to senior level majors. First time last year, good luck. So you've showed weaknesses in student learning that we need to address, great. Use parts of the GCI for intro courses. So that's the Geoscience concept inventory. I didn't mention that one here, but that's a well-established course. And as Eric mentions there, it is focused on sort of intro level. It doesn't necessarily the senior level learning that you would expect. Just use of value rubrics to help design our own rubrics aimed to assess the entire campus learning. That's great. That's a lot of work there. Survey faculty, teaching field camp capstone, qualitatively assessing how each year's group did in comparison with past experience. We could stand to build a more specific rubric. Instead, we use more of an open-end discussion. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think when comparing year to year, the more that you can use a standard rubric, the more useful results there will be, although that rubric can absolutely include, Karen mentioned metacognitive skills, or I mean, it can include things like behavior and affective domain beyond just content too. Karen, feel free to jump in here. I'm just talking away.
So Heather, you do an in-house test in all of your undergraduate courses. That's amazing. That's a lot of data.
And still working on what to do with the data.
I'm still working on what to do with my data too, and I don't even collect that much of it. So
yes, too much data is the problem. So I think it's sort of a prelude to one of the things we'll mention at the end, that you don't need to do all of, like, it can be useful to collect the data. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to analyze all of it every single year. But then that can lead into a larger research project for someone. Okay, this is great. Lots of good ideas in the chat. So I'm going to turn it to Karen now for the next few.
Great. So another tool that you could think about using is a student portfolio. So this is a collection of materials that the students put together to demonstrate how they have met each of your program learning outcomes. So on the right, I've shown just a fake student portfolio that might be given to you as a Google Doc, for example, where each of these rows is a learning outcome. And for each of those learning outcomes, the student has provided links to other documents or descriptions of things that they've done that they think demonstrate how they have met that learning outcome. And then also for each of those learning outcomes, there is a student reflection. And so in that reflection, the student might describe what they included in the portfolio and why or how it relates to the outcome, and then maybe a student self-assessment of the degree to which they think they have attained that learning outcome. So creating this type of portfolio, you can imagine would be pretty time consuming for students. It's something that you could think about building into your program over time. So for example, at the end of each semester, maybe students get a prompt in all of their classes to, hey, what have we done this semester in this course that you might want to include in your portfolio? Which of these learning outcomes do you think you made progress on meeting during the work that we did during this course? So they could build that over time. And then there might be some final reflection or additional kind of moving things around and deciding what artifacts are most effective in that portfolio as part of a senior capstone or seminar course. So I think one of the advantages to using a portfolio is that there's a direct connection between the assessment and the student learning outcome, right? So the learning outcomes are there and you're asking students directly, show me how you have met this. So there's that direct connection. Maybe some challenges, one that it is time consuming to look at. It's also would be very time consuming to evaluate all of these portfolios depending on how many students you have graduating from your program each year. You would want to have a rubric that would help you to evaluate what the student has included and how they've reflected on their learning. So yeah, let's talk about those in the chat. So same questions, have you used student portfolios? If so, what have you found useful? What questions do you have? I think
So
Google Docs. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention this is something Pranoti mentioned my joint appointment in science education. So we have future teachers prepare student portfolios, and it is one of the things that Karen already mentioned, but it's very true that it is very useful for them to have this compilation of the work that they've done. They don't always see it that way because it is a lot of work, and just keeping track of all of that stuff is challenging for students. So Nathan asked, how do you make students do this? We made students do it because they had to get signed off on that student portfolio in order to get approved for their student teaching. So that's a different program. I haven't used it in geology.
Yeah, so I've built it into a class, essentially a senior level class, where it was an assignment in the class that they completed a portfolio.
Karen, did they have trouble like keep having artifacts? Was it challenging for them?
Yes,
To
it was, and I think that's why I mentioned trying to build it in over the course of the program. So if students are only hearing about it when they're seniors and you're asking them to do it as part of a class, unfortunately, there will be students who say, well, I threw everything away. Maybe that's less of an issue now that everything's done electronically, but if you introduce this idea of the portfolio early in the program, or if you're talking about your program learning outcomes as part of your program and students are aware of them, it can be something that you're kind of building into the culture of the program, where students are asked to kind of save things or put them on reserve that they think demonstrate how they've met those outcomes. Okay, great. So Dory says that they use a portfolio and talk about it early in their career so that they know what's coming. Yeah. Surveying alumni is something that we're going to talk about in a moment. Okay, so one important component of the portfolio is actually the reflection. It's not just here's a stack of things that I think show that I can communicate. It's having the student actually think about their communication skills and how they've grown. And so you can do some of that reflection even independently of a portfolio. So for example, you could create a survey or a knowledge survey that asks students how well they think they've met each learning outcome. So an example of this is shown on the right. The example, this is a learning outcome from the BS Geoscience program at Boise State. And we have an exit survey that we give to seniors, and it asks them to respond to a series of statements that correspond to our learning outcomes. So they respond to each one on a Likert scale. So this one is, I'm able to interpret the rock and sediment record. Do they agree with this statement? Do they disagree with this statement? I think this is maybe about 3 years of data. And so you can see about 88% of students agree or strongly agree that they can do this, right? That they meet the learning outcome. You could do something similar in an exit interview or a focus group discussion that asks students to reflect on how well they think they've met those learning outcomes. Go to the next one, Anne. Another way that you could do this is to ask graduating students to complete a curriculum matrix. An example of that is shown here. So in this spreadsheet, each row shows a program learning outcome, and each column is a course that's required in the program. And so students were asked which courses helped them to meet each of those outcomes at an introductory, developmental, or mastery level. And so they've, in each of those cells, they've entered a 1, 2, or a 3 to indicate the degree to which each of those courses helped them meet the learning outcome. And if the cell is blank, it means that either the student didn't take the course or that the outcome was not addressed in that course. And so this doesn't measure how well students meet each outcome or even the degree to which they think they met the outcome. It's just providing information on how regularly and at what level students think they are practicing or doing something that is related to each of those outcomes. So this is just one student filling in this spreadsheet. This is something else that I ask seniors to do in our program. So it's another example of data that's just sitting around in my office that I've not done anything with. But if you combined all of those matrices together, you'd have a pretty good idea of which classes are helping or which classes students think are helping them meet each of those outcomes. And so that could be used by the department to reflect on which outcomes need more attention. So for example, you can see, it's probably too small for you to read, but the darker green indicates that the outcome is met at a higher level. So if you look across some of those rows, there's mostly light green and maybe one cell of dark green. Those might be outcomes that need more attention in our program, right? Because students are only practicing them at an introductory level across the courses that are required. Great. Why don't we open up the chat again? So have you used any type of reflection or exit interview as part of your assessment? And what have you found useful?
Well, people are typing that in. There were a couple good, interesting comments about e-portfolios and the idea of transfer students or community college students. And we are also a university that has a large proportion of transfer students. So it's a good point about if you're looking at these sort of across multiple classes or submitting signature assignments in multiple classes, you need to kind of recognize what your student body is and where they will either all be in those classes or if transfer students would give you something when they arrive. Have you dealt with that at all, Karen?
We also have a lot of transfer students, and so students will just leave those columns blank in their matrix, like if they haven't taken them at Boise State. But we were talking about portfolios. So with portfolios, students tend to be putting things in their portfolio from later in their undergraduate career. So things from 300 and 400 level classes. So that kind of aspect of growth might be missing from the artifacts, but it's still something that students could talk about in the reflection part.
I really love the idea of having students look at the matrix in the same way that the faculty have hopefully at some point created that matrix and said they think that they're right where they are on the scale with their course and seeing how that compares to what the students are getting from it. I think that's that's brilliant and really helps helps that whole process be transparent.
Okay, exit interviews. Great. So you have the advisor do an exit interview with students, and then they write a summary to share with the chair. That's great. We used to do those as well, and I used to do them, and I stopped doing them because I think I wasn't wasn't great at facilitating them, and sometimes it ended up being the information was maybe less useful than it could be. But having somebody maybe outside of the department even trying to facilitate or lead that might be a good idea.
So that's a good point. Again, for our teacher preparation program, we've had, it's not quite an exit interview, but it's more like a mock job interview plus exit interview. And we have principals come in to do those interviews with them and reflect with the students on their, where they could, what in the program prepared them for that. And thanks for that comment, Eric, about community college faculty members. So Eric, full disclosure, Eric's at Highline College, which is one of the feeders for Central Washington University. So I do get lots of his students. And I know that many of you are in the same situation where you have close connections with community colleges, or you're the community college person that has a close connection with the four-year college. So I think that's a great conversation to have about how you can, you know, in some cases, I think our community colleges the students that come in are even better prepared than our native students. So some of those conversations about how we could share some program assessment would be really useful too. Okay, we'll go to.
Great, next one. So the last tool or strategy we'll talk about is getting feedback from alumni and employers. And I think this provides a different perspective on student achievement of learning outcomes. You know, similar, someone mentioned earlier in the chat, just getting faculty feedback from the faculty teaching field camp. What's your sense of how well students are meeting the learning outcomes this year compared to last year, and so on? So I think you know, you might seek feedback from alumni who graduated several years ago, or from employers who have hired your alumni or who still have alumni working with them. And maybe just a word of caution here is that I think that you would need to get feedback from a pretty large sample of people to really make use of this kind of information. And that also some of the information that you collect may be outdated. So for example, if you're seeking alumni who have been out of your program for 5 years or 10 years, they might have experienced quite a different program from what your current students are experiencing. So I know that when I talk to alumni from my program, they'll often say, oh, I wish I had a programming class. You know, I have to do so much in MATLAB or R or whatever. I wish I had learned more of that. Well, now all of our students are required to take a class like that. So, I mean, it's useful to hear that the change that we made is valuable, but you know, what students experience now is different from what students experienced 5 or 10 years ago. I think also, you know, feedback from alumni will be very specific to their own experience and what field they're working in, what they're doing. So again, you'd want a large sample to get useful information, and the same for employers. You know, if they have, you know, you'd want their feedback to be based on working with many different students and not just 1 or 2 students from your program who may not be representative of everyone there. So I guess all of that is to say that I think it provides a useful perspective, but I think that you would want to use this type of information as a supplement to other assessment means. But I'm interested to hear in the chat how other people are using alumni and employer feedback. Great. So Nathan says they're doing this on a 3-year cycle, sending out 60 to 100 requests for surveys, but only get about 10 to complete it. Yeah. So that's a pretty small sample of that large number of surveys that you're sending out. You know, and I don't think that information is not valuable, right? It may prompt your thinking in a new direction, or point out things that you might want to talk with faculty more about as potential changes. So it can be a piece of data.
I think one of the challenges too with alumni surveys is that you get responses from the students that are probably most attached to the department and had the best experiences. And you may not be getting a truly representative set of responses. We all know how well student evaluations and courses work, so you can use the same filter, I guess, on some of those survey responses.
Great. So Alumni Advisory Board, great. Meet once per year to discuss program changes. Great. So is that your kind of previewing changes that you might make and getting feedback from alumni before you actually make those changes?
And feedback from industry alumni who return to campus to give seminars to upper division students and graduate students. That's great. That's something we use a lot as well, and the students find very useful.
Great.
Yeah. So an alumni board is a good suggestion. That's a little bit different than the sort of individual survey, like any sort of advisory board. They can, you're getting engaging people in a conversation rather than just a single response to a survey. So that can help kind of even out extreme opinions and provide broader perspective.
Yeah, I think also then they're also responding to the curriculum that you have in place, right, and changes that you're thinking about making, rather than looking backwards at something that might have already changed. I think so. That's the last tool and strategy we were going to talk about, but I'm curious to hear, are there other tools and strategies that we didn't talk about that you are using and finding valuable? There must be something that we didn't talk about. You all have good ideas.
No, there's a lot of great information here, and I guess just this is a good time to open it up for any questions or thoughts about all of what we've talked about, and can go back to other slides or talk more about particular strategies or the or outcomes about teaching too.
Yep, that's great. Eric makes the important point that if you're adding or changing learning outcomes that are happening in the first couple of years of college, to communicate those to schools that are feeding transfer students into your program. Okay, so I guess, I hope that we made the point that it's important to think about your program and what is going to help you understand what's working individually for your program, and to identify things that are going well or that might need improvement in your program, which is going to be different from everybody else's program. So thinking about which tools are going to help you best answer the questions that you have about what's going well and what needs improvement. Another thing that maybe we didn't talk about is that, for all of these tools, you need to have some sort of benchmark or idea of what's acceptable and what would demonstrate that things are going well. So if students, what's the kind of threshold for yes, we're doing great, or hey, we have a problem, and that's something that each program, each department would want to define for themselves, and it may be different for each program learning outcome as well. Look in the chat.
Curious what other departments are doing to assess lower division classes and learning that is taking place there. We don't have a plan in this regard and only assess broad scale gen ed physical science learning objectives. Personally concerned with being overwhelmed with data. Yeah, I think that's really true. I think this is where quantitative, easily assessed data are your friend, as opposed to something like exit interviews. And that might be obvious, but I think focusing on things that are, where you can do something relatively quick and assess a really small piece of that. So I mentioned what we're working on for our 200 level courses, not necessarily the 100 level, but we decided to really focus on graph reading and data analysis skills and being able to describe what's going on in a graph and make a interpretation. So it won't be a big exam. It would be part of some other final assignment that would have a rubric to go along with it, but be a pretty small component of the course as a whole, so that it is actually easy to assess them quickly and collect the data and make some good conclusions, in very narrow, but some good conclusions about that specific skill. So that would be one of my suggestions, is just to take a narrow focus and think about one or two skills or concepts. It sounds like Karen's geologic time assessment would fall into that category too, that it's relatively narrow.
Yeah, it's narrow. And I think also some of that type of assessment that goes across the curriculum can be done informally as well. You know, if I'm teaching a class that students take after Anne's class and students enter my class and I think, hey, why aren't they better at XYZ? I thought they were practicing that in Anne's class. You know, that's a sort of informal assessment, and then Anne and I can figure out what adjustments we might make to help students make that transition more smoothly and be successful.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So Anne and Noti, let me ask a couple of questions as more folks are typing some questions. So a couple of things popped into my head when you were talking about the exit survey, you know, that sort of getting ready to graduate, you know, sort of senior. When's the best time to give that exit survey? Is it before, you know, they turn in that final thesis and get that, you know, last bit of thing that's keeping them from graduation, or what are the different methods you've used to get those students to fill in those exit surveys?
So the only thing that I've tried, and it's worked okay, so that's why it's the only thing I've tried, is to have it as an assignment in a class. So the survey is a Google form, and I say, you know, please fill out this survey, and I emphasize that, you know, it's anonymous, so it's not connected to their name, but I emphasize that the department uses that feedback to help make improvements to the program, and it's pretty short, so you know, I don't know that I get 100% responses, but I get most students responding.
I'm wondering I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, we use the same strategy. We have a senior seminar students are required to take for the degree program, and any of our programmatic assessments that we want them to take, we put in that senior seminar.
Yeah, we have the same model.
Okay. Is there any involvement of like a department chair or you know, like the undergraduate advisor or a graduate advisor that, you know, has some sort of a face-to-face exit meeting, if you will, with those graduating? You know, has anybody tried that, or is someone doing that? You know, maybe perhaps from the audience we can get some.
It sounds like Heather was doing that.
Okay.
Yeah, Heather Pekovic. It's not something we've done. There are others. That is probably often a smaller program strategy.
Probably, yeah. So Karen, you were also mentioning sort of doing, you know, assessment in a course, like, you know, or like a pre-test and not a pre-test, but a pre and a post, you know, it's before you kind of got into the nitty-gritty of the course and then towards the end. Is there some sort of a test you can do just for upper division courses? And I don't mean the CGI, you know, is there something else that is much more focused than, you know, than the broader concepts that a CGI might have? Like, say if you had a sequence of mineralogy, petrology, tectonics, right? I mean, those are kind of connected. Or if you had paleontology, sedstrat, and something else, right? So it's just sort of focused.
So, I mean, Anne mentioned you know, like the mineralogy concept inventory would be useful in a mineralogy class. For other kind of sequences like that, I've used these kind of in-house developed embedded assessments like the geologic time example that we showed. And so I've worked with faculty in my department to try to develop question sets that they think are focused on the most important ideas and concepts from their courses. The challenge there is trying to write questions that lower level students can answer and upper level students can answer better, right? So you want there to be an answer, but that you would see growth in what that answer looks like over the course of either the program or a shorter sequence of classes that are related. But that's another example of like data that I've been sitting on that's not seen the light of day really. So
Right. Thanks.
Yeah,
I should work harder.
That's a good point. It is really challenging to write those questions well so that you can see that kind of growth, that you don't want sophomores to be able to fully answer it, but you also don't want them to get feel bad about themselves because they can't answer it. So there's also some nuance with administering it. And Pranoti, to your point, there are several other more course-specific types of pre-post assessments. I use in structural geology the geologic block cross-sectioning test. So that's focused specifically on a spatial skill. I use it as a pre and post. It's super informative to me. It's very helpful. It's also very specific to a type of spatial thinking that is really important for structural geology. It's kind of one component of one learning outcome for the whole program, but it's not out of the realm of possibility to think about doing that kind of thing in multiple courses and kind of compiling all of that and assembling it and thinking about it as well through all of these pre-post assessments. We're improving these skills that are important to the program as a whole.
Okay, thanks. And yes, thanks, Heather, for responding in the chat. She says ours is a face-to-face exit interviews. We have about 100 majors. We do the interviews when they meet with their advisor to file their graduation paperwork. That's a good time to catch them, but you only catch 30 to 50% of the students each year. Too hard to track down everyone. Yeah, I can imagine if you have that many majors, it's hard to do that. So other questions in the chat? Any burning questions you haven't asked? I'll give you another one.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, this is Leela. So I just had a question for Anne and Karen. Going back to the alumni and the employer feedback, do you know of any departments, anyone that's doing feedback from, say, employers of internships or students that have taken internships to get a more point-in-time assessment of what's going well, what's not, and skills that are needed?
That's a great idea. And I don't know if that's happening in my department, and I don't know if that's happening in other departments. Anne, do you do that?
We don't. I do know one place that it's happening, or at least was a few years ago at UC Davis, because they have a lot of students going into internships. I don't know if there's anyone here from Davis. I'll pause for a second, but I know that they have done that. I think it's useful if that's a big component of the program. So as they sort of grew their internship program, they saw the need to be more mindful of the assessment and did implement more rigorous feedback from the employers in that case. So I think, seeking out the programs that have lots of internships, they might have more information about how they incorporate feedback from that, because it's a really useful metric.
Great, thanks.
And have a question there. Any suggestion on how to make the most of required institutional academic program review? We have an upcoming required 3-year review cycle as part of institutional accreditation. Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I guess I think some of our final thoughts really do cover that, which is a lot of times this programmatic assessment feels like something that someone else is telling you to do for accreditation or for checking boxes on with the administration, but approaching it as a way, like really focusing on what you want to know, I think can help make the workload more manageable, because even the accreditation folks don't feel that you need to assess, well, I shouldn't speak for all of them, but at least the two different ones that I've experienced don't expect that you assess every outcome every year or include every student's work in those evaluations. But as long as you're seeing some sort of meaningful and serious reflection on the results that allow you to make changes or not make changes, right? To say that you're meeting what your own expectations or not is useful. So I think that just thinking about what is truly going to be most helpful to you in making the program that you want for your students. And I know that sounds sort of pie in the sky and super optimistic, but that's my own feeling, because it helps you sort of narrow what seems like an impossible task to something that will truly help your own department or program. Anyone else, feel free to jump in too. So if you, yes, Heather.
Yeah, exactly. If you have to do it anyway. Yeah, and I Heather, we're also on a 3-year internal review cycle, and right, you can kind of use it as the excuse to get as many faculty as possible involved in the conversation and thinking about what are the outcomes and what data do we have that would show that students are meeting those outcomes. And I think it's not something that everyone is thinking about all the time. So yeah, if you have to do it anyway, make it useful and get everyone thinking about it. I think we've also tried to make some pretty specific recommendations based on that internal review. You know, what are some things or some steps that we would like to take before the next review cycle that we can work towards that are related to each of the outcomes?
So this is Pranoti again. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm wondering if we should go to the next slide. Leela, if you want to take over. And we see another question coming in, and that is, does anyone have suggestions for non-student learning program assessment that might include faculty professional development, outreach, research, other supporting other programs, or other activities or programs that departments do beyond their own major?
I mean, I'll just mention we do have a lot of interest in peer teaching evaluations here, and I think those are most useful when there are some goals for what you're looking for, whether that's at a department level or a university level, so that it's what are the benchmarks, or what do you want people to improve towards if you're evaluating their teaching. So I think we're not quite there yet in terms of how we do structure our peer evaluations, but that's something I think would be useful. Like I said, I've used the Copus, I've used other tools for doing peer evaluations that help provide feedback in a useful format. But we don't necessarily have those goals that we're working towards. So Eric, you're thinking of other kinds of, like a rubric or goals for involvement in outreach or research, or sort of interdisciplinary program involvement? Yeah, I mean, it seems like I guess a lot of where I would look for that in in my setting is the sort of specific goals in terms of review, tenure, and promotion. Actually, is where some of those things show up. What we have expectations for outreach, for research, trying to think about what departments do beyond teaching. Yeah. I'm not familiar with any instruments or rubrics, but I think that's something that falls into the category of absolutely goals you can set for your own program. Yes. Teaching is important, but it is not all that we do, for sure. We all wear lots of hats.
Great. So keep your questions coming, and I hope everybody got a chance to get Anne and Karen's email address. And of course, you have access to the slides, and you will have access to this recording in the coming weeks. So feel free to, reach out to them or reach out to us if you have questions and you'd like them answered. So if you're interested in other ways to engage with other department heads and chairs, feel free to contact me. I'm at the American Geophysical Union. We have a Heads and Chairs program and a community where you can participate. And if you're interested in our annual workshop that takes place at the AGU meeting, you can also reach out to me. This year it'll be virtual, just like all other meetings that are taking place virtually. And Leela, if we could go to the last slide. So we have potentially one more webinar that is coming up next month. And so hopefully you will join us for that. And if you have missed any of the previous webinars this semester or in previous years, please go check them out. There's a great inventory of all the Heads and Chairs webinars and other webinars at the AGI's webinar website. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Karen, for a wonderful, wonderful, very informative webinar. We have learned so much. And thank you to all the participants for your active engagement with all your questions and using the chat. So please reach out if you have additional questions. And thank you very much. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. That was a lot of fun.